All right, well, today we're going to be talking about ethics. And ethics is what's often called an ought question. We finished up the is questions, questions like what is reality, what is true, what are people, and now we're moving to what ought people to do, how ought we to live together. And you might think of ethics as a purely ought question, since it's about how you ought to behave. It's how you ought to choose what to do, what kind of judgments to make about actions that have already happened. But even with the question of ethics, we need to start with an is part of the issue, because we have to understand what is our moral sense, what is moral reasoning, how do humans make moral decisions, how do we decide what is moral and what is not. So we often will have ethical discussions by creating scenarios to highlight issues. So you may have heard of the case of the runaway trolley.
Sorry.
That's okay. Actually, my sound is on too.
Yeah, it's Giving Tuesday, so my thing's been
Expand
going off all
anyway.
day.
Yes, half the time. You can do a setting if you have an iPhone. Say,
Yeah, I turned it off.
block unknown callers.
Yeah.
Anyways, so the question is not just how we do moral reasoning, but then we have to decide what to conclude with those reasons. And so we often will set up these moral scenarios to clarify values or to highlight contradictions. So you may have heard of the story of the runaway trolley, right? You're driving the runaway trolley. You're on a trolley car, the brakes have failed, and you see a switch track up ahead. And on one side of the switch track, you see a baby in a carriage. On the other side of the switch track, you see 5 escaped criminals. And you have to decide, what do I do? Do I switch to the right track and kill the one baby, who we assume is innocent? And do we switch to the left track, or do we switch to the left track and kill the 5 escaped criminals? And so you can get into arguments over the death penalty, you can get into arguments over any kind of conscious decision to willfully kill someone, because you could just throw up your hands and let the train go where it's going to go. The cost-benefit analysis of 1 life versus 5 lives. What if the baby grows up to be Hitler? Like, you can go into all kinds of debates about that. Or the other example of a scenario that I find interesting to grapple through is a story of a group going spelunking, cave exploring. So this group has gone deep into a cave, and all of a sudden the water level in the cave starts to rise. And they can't get out the way they came in. And they scramble into a large chamber, and they see at the very top of the chamber a hole that leads to the outside. And so they clamber to the top to get to that hole. And unfortunately, the first person who tries to get through the hole is a little bit, in Yiddish the word is zaftig, like, hefty, and gets stuck in the hole. Well, their head is out of the hole, their feet are going to get wet, but they're going to live. Everyone else, on the other hand, may drown if the water keeps rising. Now, fortunately or not, one of the members of this party has a stick of dynamite. And the question is, are they allowed to widen the hole? Now understand that widening the hole will intentionally kill this person who's blocking up the one exit. On the other hand, if you don't widen the hole, you will allow the rest of the party to drown, potentially. And so you have to make this question, you have to grapple through this debate of intentionally killing one person to save many people. And you might say, well, okay, in this case, it seems very obvious if they're going to die anyway. The person who's stuck might volunteer and say, sure, go ahead. But then you see other scenarios that ask more difficult questions. If you're allowed to kill one person to save many people, could I kidnap someone off the street and steal their organs and blood? Because after all, I could save many people with the organs and blood of one healthy person. You got 2 kidneys, you got a liver, you got eyes, you got all the volume of blood, especially if they're O negative, right? I mean, that's a very valuable person to save lives. But there's part of us that would say, no, you can't do that. There's some line there that we would draw that wouldn't allow you to simply kidnap someone off the street. So we make a distinction between imminent death in a spelunking scenario where most people would agree you can widen the hole, and randomly kidnapping someone off the street to steal their organs and blood, even though on some level there's a comparable ethical scenario there. But before we decide the right action, you have to decide what are the values that are in conflict here. There's not taking innocent life, right? There's saving people if you can save people. There's minimizing harm. If you have to choose between 1 and 5 deaths, then maybe you'll choose the 1 death. There's also the inalienable human right of dignity in life. You know, that all things being equal, we wouldn't just kidnap someone off the street and take them, because that both puts us at risk of being taken the next time, right? Who's to say we're not going to be the one kidnapped? But also violates some core value of human dignity and autonomy and, you know, self-preservation. So once you have these varieties of values, now you have to decide what's more important among those values. And really, ethics is not just a question of listing values, but it's prioritizing among values. And it's deciding which is the more important at issue here, because some ethical decisions are not really that hard. You know, like if you see someone leave their wallet at the counter and they're walking out, it's not really a hard decision to say, well, hello, you left your wallet, versus taking it and sticking it in your pocket. I mean, that's not really a strong debate on either side of that issue. It's when you have conflicts of duties that it becomes more complicated, and that's where ethical debate really takes place. But the challenge to understanding these values in conflict is that different peoples and different cultures tend to have some common categories of moral reasoning, but they weigh them differently. So, for example, and I realize I do have to actually set up the camera, so I'll keep talking while I do that. So, for example, let's say you have a job that you want to hire someone for. And you have a cousin who's applying for the job, and you have a stranger who's applying for the job. Now, if you're in a culture that values family loyalty, why would you ever hire the stranger? Of course you'd hire the cousin because he's a relative, so maybe you can trust he'll do a good job, and of course you want to make sure your family's employed versus strangers, and it'd be disloyal to the family to not give them the job when you have some control. But in other cultures, if you have hiring control over a job and you give it to your cousin, in fact, if you don't recuse yourself from the very decision to hire anybody when your cousin's involved, that's sort of what I'm doing here, then you're being unethical. It's called nepotism. So this is part of our dilemma in deciding the weighting of values, is that different cultures weigh them differently.
Well, wouldn't that also come true, for example, the Aztecs felt that human sacrifice was necessary for the well-being of the society as a whole, or Vestal Virgins is another example of that, you know.
Right.
There are societies who view ritual killing as something that needs to be done.
Sure, sure. So this is one of those questions of balancing the values. Like most cultures have a treat everybody fairly rule. Even cultures that support that kind of what we would call nepotism, there's still a value of treating everybody fairly, but in the choice between treating everyone fairly and loyalty to the family, they're going to weigh them differently. Or individual self-actualization versus serving the group. That's going to be a different dynamic in different cultures and different places.
I'm not exactly sure how this fits in, but it just, I find myself thinking about the movie Munich, which was really a complex moral tale, where, you know, the story is about after the Olympics when the Palestinians murdered the Israeli athletes.
Munich, yeah.
And then afterwards, Israel, or like there's one guy in particular who, I think it was for some years afterwards, went after them and one by one knocked them off. And
made some mistakes too.
Made some mistakes. Yeah. Well, but there, you know, depending on who you talk to, you get very different reactions about was that a good thing or a bad thing. I had some members of my family who were saying, "Oh, this is like it's anti-Israel. It shows them as bad guys and this and that." My take on it, and it wasn't entirely mine. I think I may have heard something that the Jacob said, was that because killing people has a corrosive effect on your soul. I'm using the term soul very loosely in a sort of linguistic way. And so in that sense, it was at least, well, I don't know, it was a bad thing to do, but it was at least a harmful thing to do for the person doing it. But there was also the sense of, if as a country you allow other agents of another country to kill your citizens, that's not okay. You really, as a country, are required to do something, whether it's punitive or as a future disincentive or whatever. And that this guy was actually kind of a martyr of sorts. He was willing to sacrifice his own moral well-being because there was another good that he was serving by doing that.
You want me on that wall, you need me on that wall. To quote a different movie.
Yeah.
There's actually a very powerful scene in that movie, I remember, where some of the members of his group are discussing, is this the right thing to do or not? And one of them tells a story that even during the Exodus, when Pharaoh's army is getting drowned in the Red Sea after the waters come crashing down, the angels are celebrating, and God says, don't celebrate because these are my children who are drowning. And one of the other members of the group says, no, that's the wrong moral of the story. The true moral of the story is don't F with the Jews. And it's reading the same story, but in a very different angle.
I think if you take that a step back, though, it's very clan-oriented. So, for example, where we did our work in Kenya, everybody who belonged to that particular clan, which is their family, is in the group, but anybody who's not, you're
And the
not
ancestors are in the group too.
Yeah, the ancestors in the group, but the people next door are not. And what's interesting that amongst the Luo, the people that we work with, they had a proverb that said, you marry your enemy, because you could not marry a woman from inside your clan, so you had to marry her from outside. But that meant that you were marrying someone who was the daughter of an enemy, although you were forgiven for not going on cattle raids against your father.
That family,
that
right.
was okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting how
The whole concept of us and them,
Right.
in group and out
Goes
group,
way
it's
back.
very evolutionary, elemental.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it in
Highland
chimpanzee
clans,
behavior.
yeah.
Right. So one of the challenges in ethical studies is that a lot of them have been done in Western universities. And they're done with college students, right? And one of the challenges is that these societies are not typical of the human experience globally. In fact, one scholar describes them as weird societies, as an acronym. That they're generally white, they're generally educated, they're generally industrialized, they're generally rich on a global scale, and they're generally democratic. And if you grow up in a white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic society, you're going to have very different expectations of moral reasoning and personal rights and human rights and individual freedoms than you would in a non-white, non-educated, non-industrialized, poorer, less democratic, more autocratic society. So the very context of who you're studying is going to affect what you understand about moral reasoning. Now, there's a wonderful book that I recommend to everybody, multiple times, called The Righteous Mind. It's by a moral psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. And in this book, he's collected a lot of research that other people have done too, where he describes the different categories of moral reasoning that people tend to use when they're evaluating, is something moral or not? Is this action a moral action or not? So if you describe the blowing up the person to get the people out of the spelunking cave, you could present that scenario to someone and then have a debate, is this a moral, or is this immoral or not? Is there a moral problem with this? And Haidt in his book actually presents some really, I don't know who came up with these scenarios, but they're interesting. So one of them is you have a family that has a dog, and one day someone backing out of the driveway accidentally runs over the dog. And it's very sad, and they're all very sad, and they have a memorial service for the dog, and they remember the dog very fondly, and then they cook the dog and eat it. Is that morally wrong? And people want to find a way to say it's wrong because they're kind of disgusted by it on some level, but they're not exactly sure why it's wrong, because they're not wasting the dog. The dog is in fact becoming part of them. They respected the dog. It was totally an accident. They didn't intentionally, cruelly, torture the dog. I mean, this is their way of honoring the dog. And who are you to say they're wrong? Does it hurt you that they eat the dog?
And what if it's not your dog? What if it's your neighbor?
Well, that's different. their dog is different.
He already ran over the person, so you're not actually taking a life.
I see. Well, but as an accident, their family might have something to say.
Yeah, that's true.
So anyways, the
There are
point,
cultures where people eat their dead relatives.
yes, right, exactly.
Not many, but they do.
Right, and so some of us would say there's something morally wrong about that, but we can't exactly put our finger on why it is. And there are other areas where we have a clear sense of why we think it's morally wrong, and that fits into the categories we're used to thinking about. So he describes these 6 basic categories of reasoning of whether something is moral or immoral. The first one that is common across the political and religious spectrum is care or harm. Does this action help someone or does it hurt someone? You know, if I'm beating someone up, if I'm giving someone a meal, you know, that can be easily evaluated as moral or not by does it help someone or hurt someone. The second category is fairness or cheating. Are you treating everybody fairly? Are you, having equal weights and measures, to quote a biblical law, or fair judges, not taking a bribe, right? Or are you letting people cheat and get away with things? Are you indifferent to people stealing from the Social Security Administration, or letting people cheat on their taxes or whatever? A third category is loyalty or betrayal. Are you loyally supporting the group or the ideal that you're working for, the cause? Or are you undermining it or even working against it in some kind of secretive way? And for some people, that is a moral category. Witness the reactions people had to Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, which for them was a betrayal. It was a violation of his loyalty to the flag, the country, the ideals. People were genuinely upset at him on a moral disgust kind of a level. The fourth category is authority or subversion. Do you support or do you undermine the group leadership that you're a part of? And again, we might say in our anti-authoritarian post-1960s era that it's good to undermine authority. Well, what did we think about people who didn't like the CDC during the COVID pandemic?
Or Kerry Lake.
Or people who won't accept the results of elections. Right, so there is a sense of sometimes what undermines the group leadership or structure can be immoral. That sometimes group authority is important to enforce and to value. Certainly if you think about it in an army unit, being an individualist and disagreeing with authority can get everybody killed, and that would be immoral. A fifth category, and this is one that's really hard for mostly secularized people to sometimes get their hands around, is sanctity or degradation. Do you reinforce the special or sacred status of something or someone, or are you polluting it with what Sherwin-White used to call moral schmutz? Like, you've polluted it, you've not betrayed it, it's you've defiled it. Think of defilement, right? So you can have ritual purity laws, you can have the holy objects that aren't to be messed with. You may recall there was a photograph, piece of art in 1987 called Piss Christ.
Oh, yeah.
By an artist named Andres Serrano. Is creating and developing that a moral violation? Well, we who are not Christian might say, what's the big deal? It might be poor taste, right, to take a crucifix and then immerse it in a vat of urine and take a picture of it.
Or people that are throwing tomatoes at what's considered good works of art.
Well, nowadays, right, or people,
Mashed potatoes, whatever.
right,
Yeah.
violating works of art just to make a point about climate change or something else.
Yeah.
Right. Now, maybe we would say the free expression of creating a piss Christ work of art is worth poor taste, is worth offending some people. And after all, who's physically harmed by this, right? It's free expression. And one of the prices we pay for free expression is sometimes being uncomfortable. Right? So maybe that's the evaluation we make. However, what if an artist created Piss Martin Luther King Jr. and put a picture of him in a vat of urine? Or Piss Ruth Bader Ginsburg and put a picture of her in a vat of urine? Or Greedy Jew Ruth Bader Ginsburg and put her in a vat of gold coins? I mean, I can see plenty of people with moral disgust in response to those pictures because there's a sanctity being violated there. It's just not a religious sanctity. It's a political, ideological, emotional, cultural, our group sanctity that's being violated. And also keep in mind that today we live in an era where people are more willing to accept that words and images can be psychologically harmful. It's not just whether it harms you physically, but it can harm you emotionally, it can harm you spiritually, if you use that language, or psychologically. And so we're more willing to restrict free expression to avoid those hurt feelings or emotions. And this is an ongoing debate. I mean, if you're on Twitter still, I signed out a couple weeks ago, but people who are still there are dealing with more and more of this language that before was not allowed for precisely that reason. And those who have swung the pendulum toward the free expression side value that more than the offensive questions. And that's that last category of moral reasoning, which is liberty or oppression. This is more often affirmed by, let's say, more libertarian-oriented people who are interested in individual rights. Does this further or affirm individual self-determination, or does it overly restrict personal freedom? That's that liberty or oppression valence. And so it may be that you're trying to help me, but the way you're helping me is restricting my liberty in a way that I find problematic. This is that example of like conflicting duties, right? So if the way I can receive some help to pay my bills is that I have to grovel in front of your doorstep for you to give me the money, or I have to let you put a monitor on my phone, or I have to do random drug testing, or you can imagine the kind of hoops people would have to jump through to receive that assistance. And so even though you're trying to do the ethical thing, but in the care harm category, you may be violating the liberty self-actualization category. And so now there's a conflict of ethical duties, and some people would say it's immoral to help them in that way because you're undermining their self-agency. So these different categories of moral reasoning I find really useful to understand a lot of the debates that go on today, but also how we do moral reasoning in different ways and how different people value different things. And I'm sure you know people who would value the authority rule more than you would, or who would value the sanctity rules more than you might, and you might value the care and harm factor as a primary way of deciding if something is moral or not, more so than a loyalty to the group. In fact, it's funny when you get the scenario presented, a school has a dress code, and a student is looking to challenge that dress code and decides to wear something that breaks the dress code going to school. Is the student morally right or wrong? Liberals and conservatives will come up with opposite answers. Because for liberals, challenging the authority is the positive ethic, because that causes so much harm. Where for conservatives, following the authority and being part of the group is a higher value. And so they would prioritize that. So it's a really fascinating book. Haidt goes into a lot more depth into these categories. But this is the reason why I'm bringing this up is that even if we want to do moral reasoning and debate, is this moral or not and why, we have to understand how we do this and the kind of categories we fit moral questions into. So if we took the spelunking example, we can certainly see how the care harm category would relate to that, right? You might also see how how would the fairness and cheating category apply to the spelunking example? Using that lens, how would you analyze the spelunking story?
It does both. Help somebody and it hurts
Right?
others.
Well, you're punishing someone for being fat, basically, because they can't get through.
Or for going first when they're fat.
Yeah, that's probably even better.
Right. On the other hand, you might say, why should they get to live and everyone else get to die? That's not fair. They went first and ate all the chocolate cake and nobody else gets any, right? That's not fair. So you might analyze it that way. How about the loyalty betrayal category?
Well, I would need more information. Because, I mean, the question is whether it was agreed that this person should go first or this person decided to go first. If this person just decided on their own to go first, then that's a betrayal in the sense of the group, because they didn't sit there and discuss who should go first.
They should have gone out the tape measure and then decided.
Well, maybe, but I mean, there need to be a decision by the group. What I'm saying. So, I mean, if there was a decision by the group that you go first and then you get stuck, well, then we're all kind of responsible for it in a way. So,
Well,
Still same, I think it's still kind of the same dilemma, like what's more important, saving 4 lives at the cost of the 1 life.
Right.
Right, but I'm not sure that I would interpret that in a loyalty betrayal sense.
Well, you might ask about the person who's
Loyalty
stuck.
to the group.
Are they loyal to the group, willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the group? You know,
Okay.
that's another way to think about it. How about the authority subversion? Well, maybe it depends on who the person who's stuck is.
Yeah.
If the person who's stuck is really important, you know, this is that, you know, you're on a lifeboat and you can save 1 of 2 people, your mother or a world famous neuroscientist who's going to cure Alzheimer's. Who do you save?
My mother.
Another question I have about all this, what are we trying to do by understanding moral reasoning? Are we trying to figure out what absolute good or bad is, as if there is something out there that if we keep struggling with it, we're going to find the correct answer? Or are we doing something? For me, I don't believe there is such a thing. I think morality occurs between your ears. It's not something out there that you can find if you can just get your reasoning in order. And for me, it's an exercise in like, what are your own inclinations? Because I can have mixed feelings about a lot of these things and say, well, there's a part of me that feels like this, but there's another part of me that feels like that. I don't think either of these are absolutes. There's just different aspects of human nature, and moral reasoning is really a way of accessing what some of those probably fairly universal moral inclinations are. What the Kant's thing about what are the universal oughts that we have?
But part of the challenge that hate brings us, it was 2 challenges. One is this one, which is the fact that there are these universal categories of how to think through these things, but there aren't necessarily universal oughts everywhere that work the same way. You know, so love your neighbor as yourself, or don't do to others what you wouldn't have them do to you, appears in Confucius, it appears in, you know, Western religious thought. But what that means in the context of the group versus the individual may be very different in an Eastern culture versus a Western culture. So this is one of those dilemmas that the universals are not as universal as we thought. And the other challenge he brings up is whether ethics is a rational thought process at all. Because far too often we make a decision and then we rationalize it later. You know, it's our emotional mind. I mean, they've seen that, you know, the parts of the brain that fire first are the emotional ones, and then the come up with a reason later comes out. Haidt describes it as the reasoning mind is like a human being riding an elephant. The elephant is the emotional mind. And we can sometimes encourage the elephant to move in a certain direction, but if the elephant's decided where it wants to go, then it's going there. And the reasoning mind is sort of nudging along. So far too often we come up with this moral disgust reaction to something, and we don't necessarily know why. But we've come to that point without thinking about it. Now, that doesn't mean we give up thinking about it. We still do moral reasoning.
That sounds sort of like the id and the ego, though, kind of.
Right, that's right. But Freud liked to prioritize the ego in an ideal sense.
Right.
But the reality, which he even admitted, is that the id often has a lot more control than we'd like to admit. You know, that was one of his take humanity down a peg insights, was the realization that, guess what, you're not your reasoning mind even though you think you are. So all of this, I have to say, is far beyond the traditional world of Jewish ethical thinking. Because they're not thinking in these categories of moral reasoning or cross-cultural studies, or that's not how Jewish ethics historically works. But you can find examples of Haidt's ethical reasoning in all kinds of sources in Jewish life. So we'll take a look at just one example, and that is a list called the 10 Commandments. You may have heard of this as a basis of ethics, right? That's why they want to put it in courtrooms and in public schools, and this will just solve all the problems that we have. If you just have this set of rules, people will know what ethics is. Now, as I go through these, I want you to think which category in Haidt's taxonomy is this appearing. So, I am your God who brought you out of Egypt, the house of bondage. You will have no other gods beside me. Make no sculptured image or any likeness in the heavens above or the waters below. What category of morality is that?
Loyalty, authoritarian.
Loyalty, authority, right?
Authority, yeah.
Also the sanctities, right?
Well, I was
The
going
holy
to say
things,
sanctity, yeah.
right? Okay. There's nothing to do with care or harm. necessarily,
No.
or
I
fairness,
was at a trouble with that one myself. I was,
as an ethical rule.
well, and just also like how narcissistic is God?
Well, read the
Well,
Kaddish, you get a lot more.
Actually, in the Hebrew Testament, God is not only narcissistic, he's judgmental, he's nasty, he's violent, he gets
And
cross.
And so look
he's
at the
vengeful.
latter part of this. You shall not bow down to those idols or serve them, for I am an impassioned God. That's what they say now in translations instead of jealous. That sounds too personal. I'm an impassioned or jealous God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me,
Which is really
but
bad.
showing kindness to the thousandth generation of those who love me. So this is a loyalty statement, right? Love me versus betray me. It is also a care harm statement. If you really believe there's a God out there, then you better do what he says or you're going to suffer, right? So it's not that they're indifferent to that category of moral thought, but they really believe that God's going to punish you. And so following these ritual laws is important to avoid the physical damage. You will not swear falsely by the name of your God. No one will swear falsely by God's name. Where would you put that one?
Fairness, cheating.
Maybe,
I mean,
right?
there's a little bit of that, certainly.
Not the lying, yeah. Also, the holy things, right? You don't want to
Again, yeah.
Besmirch the holy name by using it incorrectly. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Well, that's clearly a sanctification, right? 6 days you labor and do your work. The seventh day is the Sabbath of God. You don't do any work for your slaves. For in 6 days God made heaven and the earth and the sea and rested, and therefore he blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. So again, the holy things for observing the Sabbath. But you could also argue there's an authority
I was going to say
question
there's
there too.
authority, there's also care harm there too, because if you don't do it,
There are
there's
punishments, and
punishments, yeah.
right. But interestingly, the argument we might make for the care harm is it's good to rest. You feel better. You reset, right? So we would make very pragmatic, like consequences arguments for why it's good to rest, as opposed to these other styles. Honor your father and mother, that you will long endure on the land God is assigning you. Where do you put that one?
loyalty.
Authority.
Loyalty or authority, right? It could be pragmatic care harm, because if you dishonor your parents when you're 6, they might hit you, right? In this era, right? Definitely. And it's also pragmatic because they have wisdom to offer and care and concern, and so there is a pragmatic side to it too. You shall not murder, commit adultery, steal, or bear false witness. So they sort of run together. So murder,
Certainly care harm.
care and harm for sure, maybe fairness also. Because notice it's murder and not kill. You often hear thou shalt not kill, but here it's literally murder because, of course, you can kill in a war, and you can kill for the death penalty, and you can kill to save someone who's about to be killed by someone else. So there are categories of permitted killing, but murder is not allowed. Committing adultery, that's probably a holiness thing, or maybe loyalty, if you think about it in an emotional sense. Do not steal, definitely a fairness cheating category, right?
Same thing with the false witness.
Yeah, and false witness, and that's also the sanctification thing, right? Do not covet your neighbor's house or his wife or his female slave or anything that is your neighbor's.
Fairness, cheating, certainly.
Fairness, cheating, maybe liberty oppression, because you're going to steal things from somebody else. Or now the challenge with coveting is it's emotional, it's intellectual, but you haven't done anything. Are you hurt if I'm jealous of your wife?
No, but Jimmy Carter was lusting after something.
Right. Well, because he was told, do not covet.
Yeah.
And so he felt guilty for what he felt.
Well, that could be loyalty too, couldn't it?
That could be loyalty too, right? Or respect for the other or something like that. So all of these categories, when you look at these 10 commandments, which ones of them are ritual and which ones are ethical? Well, you've got the Sabbath, you've got the idols, then you've got murder, adultery, right? So there are some ethical rules in there. Now, what's the reason why you're supposed to perform these rules?
To maintain a civil society.
I think there's different answers, depending on what level of analysis you're doing. I mean, you could say that we do it because this is how a group can endure and get along and, have
Well, that's what I say, it's
a
sort of
culture that
it's sort of
works.
a covenant in a sense for civil society to exist. You have
It's
rules.
authority too, isn't it? You were told to do it, so.
And
you
why
better
these
do it.
rules? Well, look at the next verse. All the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking. And when they saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, we will obey, but don't let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses answered the people and said, be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, and that the fear of God may be ever with you, so you do not go astray. Why do you have to do this? I am Yahweh your God. Why do you need the broom of the Wicked Witch of the West? I am the great and powerful Oz. There's no reason.
Still sounds
It's
like
authority.
authority to me.
It's absolutely authority. And there are plenty of there are plenty of laws in the Torah that will say, do this and such,
Oh.
I am Yahweh your God.
Oh, yeah.
Do this and so, I am Yahweh your God. Don't have a garment with linen and wool in the same garment. I am Yahweh. There's no reasoning given. Sometimes there is a reason. So your days will be long upon the earth. Or so it will go well with you. Sometimes they do give a reason, but sometimes the reason is just, I'm God and I said so. Sorry, Bruce.
And you don't want to be in trouble with me if you do. Don't mess with God.
Right.
Well,
I brought you in this role, I'll take you out.
and there's plenty of examples of people that mess with God.
Right, there are plenty of object
And
lessons.
it didn't end well.
Right, right.
But to me, it just strikes me as a really good examples of an earlier stage of moral development. You know, when a kid takes his brother's cookie, and the parents say, "Okay, you're not gonna get any cookies for the rest of the week," and then the kid learns that don't do that in a way where you learn not to get caught.
Right.
Okay, so there's an early level of moral development. You don't want to get punished. Presumably, at some point, you internalize that, and now you can punish yourself, or you can anticipate punishment by yourself, and so it becomes an internalized value.
It's also an early stage of parenting,
Yeah.
because the parents haven't learned. You know, some parents will fall back on because I said so,
Yeah,
and don't give reasons why it's important.
yeah, that's true.
And look, sometimes you're tired, right? You don't have the time or the energy to do it.
But
But sometimes you're learning how to parent as well, and you fall back on that authoritarian model, which is only as good as the authority's, omnipresence and perception and enforcement, which is what you're getting with the punishment.
Until it gets internalized.
Right.
There's kind of two things going on here, because in the Hebrew Bible, God is often shown as a shepherd, and we are the sheep, and the shepherd knows what's good for the sheep, and so you better pay attention, because the sheep that stray away from the shepherd, bad stuff happens, because there's peace and so forth. But from another level, I think every society has a set of sanctions in order to maintain that society, because if it's otherwise it's just Hobbesian chaos, right? And of course,
Yeah, but this kind of God is a very common small group God.
yes, very much so. And if it's not a God, an overall God like that, it's your ancestors.
What is it? It's common. What kind of God?
Small group God.
Yeah.
It's not.
Clan or tribal God.
Oh,
Well, think of it. I mean, the Hebrews
Well, yeah,
are
but we try to avoid that.
10
word.
clans who are the chosen people. Why? This is their God. It's very specifically, and while there gets to be later on stuff about the nations accepting the Lord, the reality is that God chose the Hebrews, and He's their God. And there may be other gods, which is why it says don't
listen to them.
Don't listen to them. That's those other people, Baal and whomever else. We don't
Notice
do that.
in the Ten Commandments it said, you will have no other gods before me.
Right.
They can sit in the back of the bus,
Yeah.
but they can't.
Yeah.
You shouldn't worship them. You shouldn't pay attention to them. I'm a jealous guy. Why? If you're the only person on a desert island, who are you jealous of? But if there are other gods out there tempting you, then you might be jealous.
It's a very it's a very polytheistic
Yeah.
statement, actually.
Now, keep in mind that there's more than just the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew Bible.
Right. Yeah.
According to Rabbinic Judaism, there are actually 613 commandments
Yeah.
in the
Really?
Torah.
Yeah.
Plus some commandments that the rabbis created, like light Shabbat candles, light Hanukkah candles, read the Purim Megillah. Those are all post-Torah, so they wouldn't be in the Torah. But there's thought to be 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. 248 positive commandments. And if you have 613 total minus 248 positive, you get 365 negative commandments. Now, a positive commandment is honor your mother and father. A negative commandment is thou shalt not murder, or commit adultery, right? And some of the positive commandments are wonderful. You know, love your neighbor as yourself, have fair weights and measures. Some of the negative commandments make sense. Do not take a bribe. Do not favor the poor man or the rich person in their suit before you. Some of them seem irrelevant to what we consider ethics, like not mixing linen and wool in the same garment, or plowing a field with two different kinds of seed. Who cares?
I try to avoid doing that, but I keep it to a minimum.
Yes, right. Or gathering sticks on the Sabbath. I mean,
Only the priest can mix the garment.
I had a colleague who had a neighbor who was Orthodox, and he would intentionally go out to his front lawn on Saturday mornings to gather sticks. Just to specifically violate that rule in front of his neighbor. There's actually a Yiddish phrase for that. It's afsulachas, which means just to get him mad. Just to, dafka, just to do it right in his face to get him annoyed. I don't support that kind of, life is too short for that kind of stuff. But the traditional concept is that there are these 613 commandments, and you'll hear people bandy that word around a lot, but very few people have actually read all 613 commandments. Also, by the way, any rabbis that have tried to make a list of the 613 commandments don't always agree on what they are. So it's a number they picked, but they are coming up with it later, right? It's not like they went through and came up with an agreed list. And even more complicated, people think that these commandments all apply to everybody. But some of the commandments only apply to women. Some of the commandments only apply to men. Some of the commandments only apply to priests. So there is no one person who could actually fulfill all 613 commandments, because they'd have to be a very weird priest, king, woman, man, farmer, urban worker, hybrid, multiphasic personality. Like that, it's impossible. But the number floats around as a sign that Jewish culture is so ethical because of all these mitzvot, all these commandments that we have to perform.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do these commandments apply to people who aren't Jewish?
There's a sense, there's a concept called the Noahide Commandment. Supposedly there are rules given to Noah that are derived from the text. There are 7 Noahide commandments that are supposed to apply to everybody.
Okay.
But the 613 are supposed to apply to Jews. That's again that sense of the chosen people with special
So
attention.
another way of distinguishing you from other groups.
Right. And some of the laws are clearly, the kosher laws, that's a distinguishing against the outsider group. Now, in modern Jewish life, the word mitzvah really has 2 meanings. The concept of commandment is still there, but there's also the concept of a mitzvah. Doing a mitzvah is doing a good deed. You're helping someone out, you help someone across the street. It doesn't really matter if it's in Maimonides' list of all the 613 commandments. You're doing something nice. And so the other reason why we like that second meaning of mitzvah a little better is that we don't necessarily think following the rules by itself makes an action good. Because we might ask, is this rule good? So in the Torah...
Does it make sense at this time?
Or does it make sense now? So in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, it says, parents of a stubborn and rebellious child should take him to the elders of the city and say that he's a glutton and a drunkard and won't listen to them, and they will try him and they will stone him to death. A stubborn, rebellious child should be stoned to death. Now, in a world of authority and loyalty, well, maybe you would think that makes sense. But even in the days of the early rabbis, they didn't like that rule. Because if you've ever been a parent or ever been a child, you know that at some point, children are stubborn and rebellious. And they would all die.
And it's no way to teach a lesson.
And how are they going to learn, right?
It's like using sharp weapons in fencing. You don't have a lot of beginners after a while.
That's right. So it's survival of the fittest for sure. So the rabbis themselves go to work on this law, but they can't say we cancel the law. It's an explicit law in the Torah, and you can't say this is moot. But you can define the law. So they say, well, it says a stubborn, rebellious child, ben velo bat, son but not a daughter. So girls are already saved. They can't qualify under this law because it says a child. Keep in mind, of course, in Hebrew, the generic is male. But because it says son and not daughter, they disqualify the daughters. Then they point out that a minor is not really liable for the death penalty for any other violations that they would perform. And once they're over the age of majority, they're not really a child anymore. So there's really a limited window of time. The rabbis actually say from the time he grows 2 hairs till he grows a beard all around, but the lower beard, not the upper beard. What's the lower beard?
Yeah.
No,
Oh,
lower.
oh, that lower.
That lower beard, yes. Pubic hair. So the idea is during puberty, basically, you're at risk. But otherwise, so they've saved 95% of children by their definitions. And then they say, well, he has to qualify as a drunkard. So he has to drink this much wine, and it's a ridiculous quantity. And he's a glutton, and he has to eat this much food, and it's a ridiculous. So they qualify and qualify and qualify the law to the point that at the end of the discussion, one of the rabbis involved says, there never was a stubborn and rebellious child, there never will be. No one will ever qualify for this rule. But that's their way of dealing with what they decided was an unethical rule. They needed to refine it. And there's actually a debate about the death penalty as well. How often should a court put someone to death? And some rabbis actually say they should never put one to death. And then someone else said, well, but then you're going to multiply the murderers in Israel. You've got to have some deterrent. So they're debating what's the moral quantity of death penalties that one could expect from a court when Jews had that power. But again, they're redefining the laws in their own image. So it's not that Rabbinic Judaism was stuck with the laws of the Torah. People have this misconception that the Jews were fossilized with the rules of the Torah and the Hebrew Bible and never developed. But of course they did. They had their own legal reasoning and process and interpretation over the centuries that shifted and sometimes softened a lot of those laws. Sometimes it hardened those laws too.
It sounds like a euphemism for sophistry. They're just good at using logical arguments to try to squirm their way out of things, and you can get from point A to point. If you're good at it, you can get yourself.
Basically, that's what the Talmud is all about.
I'll give you an easy example. You've heard of this concept called the Shabbos Goy, the idea that people who observe Shabbat couldn't do certain things for
I
themselves.
learned it when Colin Powell was.
But they might have a non-Jewish person like a Colin Powell or Elvis evidently did this too at one point, who could serve to do this for them. Except it says in rabbinic law, you are not allowed to have someone do something explicitly for you that you can't do yourself on Shabbat, which is the whole point of the Shabbos Goy. So what do? You go to your neighbor's house and you say, would you like to come over for a glass of Slivovitz? And so they come over and they walk in the room and you say, boy, it's dark in here. And then they turn on the light for themselves. And then you give them a glass of Slivovitz and L'chaim, and off they go, and you got your light on. So you have to sort of work around it, and there's a whole set of vocabulary to do this, and it's following the letter of the law. Or look, go to any Jewel Osco in this area during Passover season, and you will see stuff that our ancestors would have never imagined would be kosher for Passover. But using potato flour and tapioca starch and the wonders of chemistry, you can create a chocolate cake. It's not bad.
Yeah.
But it's the letter of the law, not what we might call the spirit of the law.
And I'm going to guess when they were hurrying up to get across the water,
Red Sea, yeah.
They wouldn't have had time to make one of those chocolate cakes.
Right, exactly. Right. So,
No, probably not.
so in theory, rabbinic law, this whole system of mitzvot, commandments, is what in ethical thought is called authoritarian ethics. The authority tells you to do it, and this is what you have to do. But in practice, there is flexibility of reasoning and argument and so on, and legal proceedings. There are rabbinic courts even today called a Beit Din, a house of justice, where you can take a case there and have it argued out. In fact, in New York State, I believe, the Beit Din is recognized as a legally binding arbitrator. So it's accepted as a category of court proceeding that you can follow if you want to abide by their rules of procedure and so on. Now, there are problems with that. For example, women aren't allowed as witnesses in a rabbinic court, which we would find very offensive, but it's part of their canon of law. And what I've often heard said is that where there's a halachic or a Jewish legal will, there's a halachic way. That is, if they want to solve the problem, you can find a way to solve the problem. So people are living in high-rises now, right? Walking up 40 flights of stairs is not reasonable on Shabbat. On the other hand, then you're trapped in your apartment. You can't go to shul. So what do? You put in an elevator that stops automatically on every floor. So you're still using electricity in some way, but not by pushing a button actively. I mean, this goes back to an example in the Talmud where they said, I want to have a lamp that burns through the whole of Shabbat to be able to see, but I can't add fuel to the fire. But what if I hang a bag of oil over the lamp and poke a hole in the bottom, so a little bit of oil drips onto the fire every few minutes, and then it's running automatically. So I'm not causing it to burn, it's like a machine, it's running on its own. So there are workarounds if you want to find the workaround. If you wanted to solve the problem of women who couldn't get a divorce from their husband because they wouldn't consent, they could solve it. They wanted to solve the stubborn rebellious child, they can solve it. So even an authoritarian ethical system, if you want to find interpretive ways around it, it can be done. But in essence, just to finish the thought, in essence, an authoritarian ethical system, the rules are based on the authority telling them. If the authority is legitimate and in charge, then what they say goes. And if they're a corrupt authority, then you can challenge it. But otherwise, you do what you're told. And the real challenge for us in understanding this, and I sometimes hesitate to make this parallel, is you've heard the phrase, just following orders, as an excuse. Right? I was just doing what I was told. I was just following orders. Whether it's the Nazis at Nuremberg or the Stanley Milgram authority experiments done at Yale in the 1950s, people are sometimes willing to do terrible things by just doing what they're told. And they think they're being moral, right? That category of authority and following the authority and loyalty to the group, they're acting morally, they might think. But if obedience to authority is the only criteria for deciding if it's moral or not, well, that can lead you to do terrible things. And so we wouldn't accept authority alone as the basis for ethical behavior. And we had a couple of comments.
Well, what I find interesting, though, is sometimes authority itself decides to overlook its own rules. So just for an example, in Virginia, in antebellum times, as in all the southern states, it was illegal to have free blacks. So if you manumitted your slaves, they were supposed to leave the Commonwealth. But the reality was there were thousands of blacks in Virginia because they did all kinds of jobs and things that people needed done. The same thing happened under apartheid in South Africa. They weren't allowed to do certain jobs, but in fact, they got hired a lot of times to do these jobs because they were better at it than the white guys. So authority sometimes says like, well, yeah, that's the law, but.
Well, and I actually was just reading a book recently that made the point that people assume that pre-modern Jews were slavish followers of all of these rabbinic laws. And that's just not human nature. That's totally unrealistic. But both in the 19th century, both Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews wanted to think that. The Orthodox Jews wanted to think that because they were trying to enforce orthodoxy, right, correct doctrine and practice on everybody when people were falling, astray. And so they said, well, your ancestors did everything exactly right. And the Reformers said, yes, our ancestors did it strictly to the law, and we're freeing people.
No.
So they agreed that everyone did it when the real historical evidence suggests that there was people, quote, backsliding or being flexible or making their own choices
It's full of
all
that.
the time.
All the time. There wouldn't be so many threats and punishments if people all followed everything.
Right, exactly. Or the rabbis in medieval Spain complaining that nobody's following kosher anymore and people aren't observing Shabbat. There's tons of evidence people didn't follow the rules all the way. So no matter what your authoritarian system, people are not always going to follow it, right? All those jokes that come out of the Soviet Union about how people, dodge the rules or use the rules to their advantage. I mean, it leads to if there's so many laws, it leads to a disrespect for law because you're finding all these ways to work around it.
Well, I guess a more nuanced or maybe a hybrid way of doing it would be instead of following the letter of the law, you follow the spirit of the law. So if somebody, if you're supposed to protect the Sabbath by carving out a spiritual space where you minimize ego. So you're not thinking about future activity and you're not doing anything that could be considered work. If you set up a system where you can get your needs met that ordinarily would require work, but you can do it in such a way that it happens automatically, like putting a hole in, I never heard that one, but putting a hole in things that the lamp, that, you know, drips little by little, so you don't have to turn lights on. You get the light without having to work.
But it all depends on who defines what as work.
Yeah.
And who defines what as meaningful. You know, we are much more comfortable making rules on an individual level or deciding ethics on the individual level. But in a pre-modern setting, you know, again, that not individualized, that not democratic style where power is devolved to the people, in a more autocratic, centralized, collective identity world, you making your own standards for what's meaningful to you, what does that have to do with the law or what's moral? Now, the general style of ethics that this weird society emphasizes is more what we would call consequentialist. That you decide something is good or bad based on the consequences of the actions. And you could deal with directly the care-harm issue, the fairness issue, how does that treat people? You might deal with the system issue. So maybe a rationale for not kidnapping the one person and stealing their organs and blood is not that on the care-harm level, because you are caring for more people than you're harming, but there's something about a system with fundamental human dignity that's better on the whole as a system, because that respects your life as well, and it has you treat people better and so on. There's sort of knockoff effects that might make that the more ethical standard to follow. So it's sometimes not just called utilitarian, which is a very basic description for the greatest good for the greatest number, but rule utilitarian, where we have some guidelines that we use, and we're not just doing a raw calculus based on immediate need at any one moment. And again, you'll get differing flavors of consequentialist. What do you emphasize? Do you emphasize the individual? Then you're more on what's called the objectivist scale. Or are you more communitarian? You emphasize the good for the group. And so, but it's all based on consequences. And when you base your ethics on consequences, you're evaluating, is this good or bad based on the results, not necessarily based on the rule that somebody pronounced ahead of time. And when you're deciding, you know, what's good to calculate, you might focus on basic human needs like survival, pleasure or happiness, you know, quality of life, and personal dignity. And different people will prioritize those differently. There are times people give up survival for dignity. You know,
So Thomas More.
right. Or there are people who, if they have no pleasure or happiness in life, maybe survival isn't worth it because they're just in unremitting pain and they want to end it. That affirms their dignity, even if it's undermining their survival. So there are all kinds of balancing acts of those that we see people perform. The last topic I just want to touch on before we look briefly at our discussion questions, and I'm not going to keep you past 9, I promise. I mean, ethics in, you know, an hour and a half is fool's errand. Maybe it was unethical of me to plan to do it in one session. Is the question of whether there are specifically Jewish ethics or not. Because if you're talking about ethics in terms of their consequences, and is this good or bad based on how it affects people and how it affects me and how it affects society, isn't that just a purely philosophical discussion? And it doesn't really matter what your ethnicity or religious background or heritage or cultural reference points are. It's, you know, is caring for people or is, you know, feeding the hungry, is that Jewish specific? Or is that a universal value? As I said, love your neighbor appears in lots of other cultures. You know, respect the elderly appears in lots of cultures. You don't need to have Judaism say it. So as one example, I'll show you a very popular one that's often presented.
But couldn't be things go into one or the other. Some things could be universally ethical, and other things would be, you know, the morals or ethics of a particular group, like for Jews.
Well, the problem is that when people start to claim specific morals for Jews, they're morals that appear elsewhere too. You know, people say, well, Jews value education. Like they're the only people that value education?
Yeah.
Or Jews have a strong family structure. Well, there are other cultures that have strong family.
Right.
You know,
Well, those would be the universals, I would say.
well, what would be specifically Jewish? I mean,
I used to think about Jewish guilt, you know, until I met a Catholic girl, you know, and found out it was the same thing.
yeah. So, it's really hard to. So, I'm sort of playing the straw man here because I do think there are distinct Jewish values. I just don't think they're uniquely Jewish values. See, claiming that we invented ethics or that we have the monopoly on ethics is itself unethical to do.
Yeah.
Right? It's chauvinist.
Yeah.
But
And kind of foolish.
and stupid, right? And limited my, you know, nearsighted and so on, parochial. But there are certain values that were emphasized in Jewish culture. Honoring the elderly is a Jewish value that is reflected in Jewish sources, going back to honor your mother and father, and all kinds of rabbinic provisions for this as well, standing up when a teacher enters the room, and so on. It doesn't have to be only Jewish to still be Jewish, right? You can have that in another culture, and it's a Chinese value, and it's a Japanese value, and it's a Jewish value. So, I think
is something being a Jewish value, are you defining it as something that is unique to Jews, or something that Jews did first and then other people did also?
it's something that Jews did, period. I don't care if first or second or fifth. You see, if it's reflected in Jewish sources, if it's debated in Jewish legal arguments, if it's put into a wise saying in the book of Proverbs, it's a Hebrew source, it can also become another value. Spare the rod and spoil the child, right? Justifying all those years of abuse. Appears in the book of Proverbs. Statement of Jewish wisdom. I might call it Jewish narishkeit, Jewish foolishness. But it's there.
Really? I didn't realize, I thought it was like a Mark Twain thing.
No.
Oh, good grief, no.
No.
Well, Mark,
But I would say that's also a Christian value, because it's one that's taught in Christianity. It's one of their holy source book quotes. You know, love your neighbor as yourself is something Jesus says, so it's a Christian value. It's also something that Leviticus says, so it's a Jewish value. I don't feel like you have to claim it as only one value. It can be reflected in multiple cultures. I'll give you another example on the other side. Jewish culture has valued memory, or at least what we thought happened. Not necessarily what actually happened, but what we thought happened, we want to remember that. The command, remember what happened to you in Egypt, remember the creation, that appears a lot in the Torah. And we actually want our memories more than we want real history. There's a wonderful book called Zahor by a Jewish historian about how we prize memory over history. But there are other cultures that do not value memory at all. The Roma people, from what I understand, are one that do not keep census records, do not keep family trees, and are not interested in tracking where they lived and when. It's very hard to reconstruct their history because they don't value memory in the same way. So different cultures have different values that are distinct to them. So I'll sometimes use the analogy of my house has an attached two-car garage and a back patio, as you know, because it was your house at one point. But
Really?
is that, but is that unique to my house? Of course not. Does it describe my house? Sure. So I'm comfortable talking about specific Jewish values that may also appear in other cultures.
But if you were driving down the street and you saw a colonial house with a two-car garage attached to it, would you say, you know, that's one of those Rabbi Shalom's houses?
Well, no, I'd say it looks like my house, but it is lived in by a different family, right? Or was built by a different builder.
But you might. I mean, I grew up in a Levitt neighborhood in Long Island, and you see a house like this, oh, that's a Levitt house. You know, it's a type of, I mean, I think that.
Did it originate there?
Okay, so the question is, for it to be a Jewish value, does it have to be originally Jewish, like we made it? Does it have to be uniquely Jewish? Or can it be descriptive of Jewish? So, like, we think of Jewish food, all right? Are bagels uniquely Jewish today? No.
Weren't they originally just like Polish?
Right, exactly. Borscht,
I mean,
lox.
what we think of as Jewish food is really Eastern European. It's not.
A lot of, right, a
least
lot
in
of
this
that.
country,
Or,
anyway.
I mean, look, the foods like shakshuka, which is now a popular Israeli dish, is a Moroccan dish. It's not uniquely Jewish. But it's Jewish food because it's identified with Jewish culture, as something Jews do themselves, and it can be Jewish food and from another culture as well. I don't feel like we have to plant a flag and say this is only a Jewish value. So I want to look
It
at.
just strikes me as funny is to call some of these things
Yeah.
Jewish unless there's a compelling reason, because it's distinguished from like the values of other groups. Like to say, you know, you don't just randomly shoot an infant on the street. I think probably most other cultures will say, you know, would discourage that kind of behavior.
Right.
But I wouldn't call it a Jewish thing. I would say it's a human thing.
Right.
Yeah, but I think the point is that you're trying to describe a particular culture, which in this case has to be a Jewish culture, and we're describing the values that exist within that culture. Whether or not they exist in other cultures is sort of not relevant.
But why
Whether or
even
not
call
we
them
whether or
Jewish
not
then?
we invent it or not is really not relevant. This is what Jewish culture are. Here are the things that characterize.
So
Jewish.
that's a good question, Chet, is why bother calling it Jewish? So that's, that's one side of the argument to say if it's a value, it's a value. It doesn't matter.
Right. Or if
what
it's
label
pretty
it has.
universal, why
Or if it's
bother?
universal, why bother? Some people have an emotional attachment to having some kind of Jewish values. The idea of tikkun olam, repairing the world, they see as an important Jewish value, even though, of course, other cultures have a value of helping the world. But this is a Jewish way of framing it or describing it. I love, for example, in the Torah it says, you should not withhold a worker's wages. You pay them the same day, so that they are free to choose to work somewhere else the next day. You are not creating what we call today wage slavery, where they're stuck or you're withholding their paycheck to make them stay working with you. Give them their autonomy to make their own. I love that my people came up with that value. Now, were they the first ones? I don't care.
So Jews
But they're the
invented
only
the
ones?
independent contractor versus the
Well,
W versus the.
Or the contract employees. But look, I don't care about the origins of it as much as that this is a value that was expressed in my culture. Now, my culture also expressed the value of wiping out the Canaanites, destroying the idols, discriminating against women, not allowing somebody who was maimed or deformed into the sanctuary, so they were a lower class person. I mean, there are all kinds of Jewish values that I object to. So I make a distinction between the larger subset of Jewish values and the Venn diagram of my values, and the overlap between the two is my Jewish values. So you think those two overlapping circles, right? You've got the whole set of Jewish values, I've got the whole set of my values, and the overlap between the two are my values that I see reflected in Jewish culture. So I might be making the choices from that large library of Jewish values, but there are some of my values that I find reflected in my culture that I find culturally resonant for me.
But we
The
don't we
phrasing
find
is
that there's an
important.
evolution of the culture at the same time? I mean,
Oh, sure.
like, for example, post-priest, you know, I mean,
Or
Jewish values have
most-
changed. We're not
mo-
running off to the temple to sacrifice
Hey.
rams.
Most Jewish communities and most Jews today accept women as rabbis. Right? That's a change. That women are full people too. That's a value. And most communities have shifted in that direction from the historic Jewish values of discrimination. So here's one example of a text that's often pointed to as a Jewish value, but when you get to like the top level, you'll realize it's actually universal. So this is Maimonides' ladder of charity, and we'll go up from the bottom. The lowest level is if you give charity, but you look unhappy doing it. Oh, fine, just take it. Right? That's the lowest level of charity. A little bit higher than that is to give less than what's appropriate, but with a happy face. So you ask for $5, here's $2, but you know, use it in good health. So it's more positive. The lesser than this is to give what's appropriate to him, but after being asked. So instead of in advance, you wait for someone to ask you, and then you give it to them. The next one, to give it to the poor person in his hand before you're asked. So that's better to give it before you're asked, but you're still giving it to them face to face, directly. So maybe a little better version than that is if the poor knows from whom he is taken and the giver does not know who's getting it. That saves them the shame, right? So the great ones of the sages would put money in their sheets and roll it up behind them, and when the poor came, they would just drop the money behind them so that they didn't see. The poor knew who was giving the money, but the person dropping it behind you didn't know who was receiving the charity. Now, even better than that is when the giver knows to whom he is giving and the poor person doesn't know from whom he is taken, so he doesn't have to be ashamed when he sees that person later on. This is when the great ones of the sages would go to secretly leave money in the doorways of the poor. You just drop it off and then run away. And that's preferred, especially if the people supervising tzedakah are not doing it right. So you just give it charity direct to the people. Now, a step even up from that is where the one who gives tzedakah to the poor doesn't know to whom he is given, and the poor person doesn't know from whom he's received. It's double anonymous. And so this is a mitzvah in its own sake. You're not doing it for attention or status or anything. There was a secret chamber where the righteous would give in secret, and the poor families would take in secret, like a free public library, those little public library things. Or now there's little public pantries. People put food, and someone puts food in there. You don't know who put it in there, and someone takes food. You don't know who takes it, and it's anonymous on both sides. But that's still not the highest level of charity. The highest level, greater than which there are none. This is the person who strengthens the hand of a poor Israelite by giving him a gift or a loan, or making a business partnership, or finding him work. Strengthen his hand until he no longer needs to borrow or beg.
Teach a man to fish.
Yeah.
You can give a man a fish and feed him for a day, or you can teach a man to fish and he can feed himself for a lifetime. Not a hand out, but a hand up. Right? A job, not welfare, or whatever language you want to use for it. So this is my...
That takes away what I was about to say about the previous one.
Okay.
Which is, I could see how that would be the highest, because then there aren't any ulterior motives about, if you do this, then the person is going to be grateful to you, because they don't even know it was you who did it. So you're doing it in a purer way, because you don't need them to be grateful, and you don't even need to get to see them being happy getting it. You're just doing it because it feels right to take care of other human beings. But then the highest one, according to that, the person does get to see you, because you're giving, I'm assuming that you're giving them
business
a job.
partnership is not secret.
So you're getting that, it's sort of, there's like a secondary gain there. So.
Yeah.
But it's a very different, the first one is very different in terms of involvement. All the rest of them, it's very minimal involvement. I give, I see, or I give and I don't see. I drop my stuff off at Goodwill, and Goodwill, gives or whatever. Yeah. Here, I undertake to teach you how to be better, how to improve your life in however way that I might be doing it, whether it's taking you on as an apprentice or whatever it might be. But I now am making a commitment to you personally, which none of the other levels does.
But I could think of a good counterexample to that. You do something like that. You take care of somebody. You help them be able to you teach them how to fish, but in a way where everybody knows that you're doing it. So you get to look like a big macher, the guy who is taking care of people. And look at what you did for them. You helped this person rise up out of this terrible position. Now they're independent and doing all these things for themselves.
I'm always struck by, when you go into institutions that have people's names on them.
I was just thinking that.
Right? That's a case where the giver doesn't know who's using it, but everybody knows who the giver is, because their name is on the door, or on the plaque, or on the chair, or on the bathroom stall, or whatever they've endowed.
And you know that there are plenty of people who wouldn't have given, or at least wouldn't have given that amount, if it wasn't going to be publicly.
No, that's absolutely correct.
broadcast.
We used to have these discussions in development all the time at Northwestern.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to have the gift so it has their name on the building or the lobby or whatever it is. Nobody wants to give a gift to the maintenance fund.
Yeah.